È un piacere e un onore ospitare sul palco del WNF16 Lessig.
We're praying for the screen. Please come, screen. Let's try this. Okay, great, super. So, if you went back 70 years and you asked the world, what does the world need now? You know, in a kind of Dionne Warwick sense of what the world needs now, we would not say, they would not have said, our grandparents would not have said that what the world needs now is democracy. What they would have said is, if we could spread democracy around the world, then the problems of the world would be solved. And indeed, that's in fact what happened 70 years ago. For the last 70 years, an incredible state of progress to get to the place where democracy is almost everywhere. Rule by the people is the norm. But the question is rule by the people the fact? And the answer to that question is not so much. All across the world, there is this cynicism and frustration everywhere with democracy, with the failure of democracy to deliver what we thought it would give us when they said 70 years ago we would spread it across the world. And that failure is a corruption. It's not the corruption of individuals, it's the corruption of a system, of how the system of democracy is supposed to work. And I want to give it a name here. We're going to name it right here, and it's a bizarre, weird name you won't recognize now, but by the end you will. The name is Tweedism. Okay, so here's how you understand Tweedism. Americans had a lot of great philosophers, John Rawls, Nozick, Dewey, William James, but maybe the greatest philosopher from the 19th century, the one who at least foretold the nature of politics in the 20th century, was a guy named Boss Tweed. He was a criminal. He ran the criminal syndicate of politics in New York, Tammany Hall. But Boss Tweed used to say, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. The nominating. So the idea in Boss Tweed's system was that if he could control the nominations, he in effect controlled the elections. Now this idea, you might think, is not really American. It was actually Augustus Caesar's idea. Okay, so you have Berlusconi, we have Trump, you had Augustus Caesar, we have Boss Tweed. But the point is we have this simpatico between our cultures, and we need to recognize the genius in this political idea, the genius for destroying the intent of democracy, because what it does is make it so the people think the people are picking when in fact the choice is made long before. That's what Tweedism is. Two stages where the Tweeds pick and the citizens vote, but the filter of the Tweeds, because to run in the general election, you have to satisfy the Tweeds in the Tweed election. That filter produces a consequence, obviously, of a democracy responsive to the Tweeds only. That's Tweedism. Now, if you see it once, begin to see it everywhere. So in America, in 1923, Texas passed a law that said in the Democratic primary, only whites could vote. By law, African Americans were excluded from the primary, producing the all-white primary. A two-stage process where in the primary, the whites vote, in the general election, all could vote, but to be able to run in the general election, you had to do well in the white primary, meaning these two stages produced a filter with the consequence, obviously, of a democracy responsive to whites only. That's Tweedism. Or a year and a half ago in Hong Kong, credible number of students, literally students, high school, college, even elementary school students, turned out to protest a proposed law by China for selecting their chief executive. And what that law said was the ultimate aim is the selection of a chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Okay, so that nominating committee was going to be 1,200 people from Hong Kong, which means out of a population of 7 million, that's about 0.02% of Hong Kong. That's a tiny, tiny number. Look at how small it is right there. You can barely see it on the board. If you looked at 0.02%, this is what it would look like. This tiny, tiny square is 0.02%. This 0.02% do the nominations of the candidates who the rest of Hong Kong gets to vote among. And to be able to run in that election, you have to do well with the nominating committee. And the fear, the complaints, the criticism of the protesters was that this filter was biased, because the 0.02% would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to China only, tweedism. Okay, now all these examples of tweedism are pretty obvious. No one would look at these and say, that's a democracy. So what would we say about this example? In America, we take it for granted that the campaigns, the cost of campaigns, will be privately funded. But that funding process, the process of raising the money to fund those campaigns, is its own contest. We could say it's its own primary. It takes time. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power, dialing for dollars. This is a telephone for any of the Wired generation who doesn't understand this technology. Telephone, dialing for dollars, calling people from across the country to raise the money they need to get back into power. B.S. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn the buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is the picture of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson learns which buttons he or she must push so that his or her campaign gets to survive, it has an effect, this life of fundraising. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues to 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, this is a primary too. It's the money primary. It's not a white primary. It's the greenback primary. It's the first stage in a multi-stage process to determine who is allowed to run for Congress. To be able to run, you must do extremely well in this greenback primary. And that filter is a filter then of the funders. So we should think about who the funders are. We can focus first on who the biggest funders are. In the 2014 election, the top 100 people gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million combined. Or in this election cycle, at the end of November, 158 families had given half the money that had been contributed to the presidential election cycle. And 2 months ago, the calculation was 50 people had given half of the super PAC money that have been contributed in the election cycle so far. Those are the biggest funders, but I don't actually think those are the important ones. The important ones are the relevant funders, the people who give enough, whose contribution is big enough to matter. Not millions of dollars, but thousands of dollars, enough so that when a congressman is calling, he or she is thinking, what does this person care about? So if we think about the relevant funders, let's say people who gave $5,200, which turns out to be the maximum amount you can give to even just one congressman in an election cycle. $5,200. In 2012, it turns out there are 57,874 Americans who gave $5,200. And for those of you with an encyclopedic knowledge of populations in the world and math genius combined, what you know is 57,874 Americans is about 0.02% of America. 0.02% of America dominate the first stage in this two-stage process to elect the candidates who get to go to Congress. This tiny fraction of the 1%, we could say a Chinese fraction of the 1%, dominate the funding stage, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to funders only. Now, how do we know this? How do we know, in fact, that's what America's democracy is? Well, there's a study that comes out of Princeton, and as a Harvard professor, I don't like to talk about Princeton studies, so we put it off the stage quickly, by these two men, Martin Gillens and Ben Page. It's the largest empirical study of the actual decisions of our government in the history of American government, in the history of political science. And what they did is relate the actual decisions our government made to the attitudes of the economic elite, the attitudes of organized interest group, and then the attitudes of the average American. What they found for the economic elite is, as a percentage of elite who support something goes from 0% to 100%, the probability of that idea becoming law goes up. That's the intuition, the way you'd think it would be. The more who support something, the more likely it is that it gets passed. Same thing with organized interest groups. The more who support something, the higher the probability is that it gets enacted. Okay, here's the picture of the average voter in America. It's a flat line, literally and figuratively. What this says is that it doesn't matter what percentage of average voters support something. It doesn't change the probability of that proposal becoming law. The average voter does not matter. As they described it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average Americans appear to have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy. In a democracy, right? Here's the picture that we were taught as kids in high school about the way our democracy works, right? There we are, we the Americans, kind of middle America right there, driving the bus. That's what democracy is, right? Here's the reality of the democracy in America. The steering wheel has become disconnected from the bus because we've allowed this corruption of tweedism to develop within the election system and general destroying the possibility of the government being responsive to the people. Okay, that's the first one. Here's the second. I want to make three observations now that you understand this word, tweedism. First, tweedism is corruption. I don't mean corruption of members of Congress. I'm not talking about crimes. I'm not talking about bribery. I'm not talking about the sort of thing Transparency International talks about when Transparency International calls the world corrupt. I think it's a little bit too convenient for Transparency International to have this very narrow conception of corruption. Too convenient, because it just turns out that the Western nations aren't quote-unquote corrupt, while the third and developing world is corrupt. And I think that's an unfair, inaccurate description of the world. This is corruption that we have in America because it's corruption of a system. The system of representative democracy. We have what's called a republic, but what our framers meant by a republic was a representative democracy, which, as they described, would have a branch, Congress, that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. But the system we have now is not dependent on the people alone, because members are dependent on the people and the tweeds, the people who fund their campaigns. That's a corruption. Or you could think about this the way a geek would think about it. Here's my favorite geek. This guy's name's Zach Phillips. I saw him testify in Delaware to the Delaware legislature about the idea of corruption. This is what he said. The word corruption to me isn't attached to any moral judgment. There are many on my side who rail against corrupt politicians in Washington. Well, I know politicians. In my experience, they're generally good people, doing their best, engaged in public service. In software, if a file gets corrupted or an application causes a memory leak that crashes the system, it's not because of some moral failing or because the process is, quote, greedy. It's a design problem. There's something broken in the code that needs to be fixed. Today, money has corrupted our political system to an extent that is nearly impossible to repair. That's the sense of corruption. But what that corruption yields, what it produces, and this election cycle is the most dramatic evidence of that, is distracted political elite. The elite is focused on what the funders of campaigns want. They're distracted by the money, meaning they don't care as much about what the base of their political parties care about. And this is true for Democrats and Republicans alike. The Republicans in America, candidates during the presidential election cycle before Donald Trump became the nominee, were constantly attacking Social Security in America, the system for old age pensions in America. And what Paul Krugman commented about in this piece, Republicans Against Retirement, was how puzzling that was. Because, as he says, what's puzzling about the renewed Republican assault on Social Security is that it looks like bad politics as well as bad policy. Americans love Social Security. So why aren't the candidates at least pretending to share that sentiment? Well, the answer is that while the average Republican voter loves Social Security, the funders of the Republican campaigns don't like Social Security. So the candidates are talking to the funders and alienating the Republican voters. And it's the same on the Democratic side. When Hillary Clinton is shown to have all these incredible ties to the most powerful banks on Wall Street, most Democrats wonder, how is she actually going to be able to be independent of those powerful banks on Wall Street when she needs to stand up to them and their shenanigans that bring economies down? That distraction then yields angry and frustrated voters, alienating the base of both the Democratic and Republican parties, which makes in America ripe for the phenomenon of a Donald Trump and a Bernie Sanders, Bernie doing a little bit less than Donald Trump. This is legal corruption. And what we need to think about is that corruption is both legal and illegal. And both of them cheat a democracy. So that rather than focusing on the gold countries as non-corrupt, the way Transparency International likes to think about it, I think you need to recognize that the gold countries, because of the gold, are corrupt in the same way. And this picture of corruption should not be a picture that separates developed from developing nations. It's a picture of the failure of democracies everywhere. That's point number one. Point number two, tweedism is inequality. That's at its core what it's about. It's the unequal status of citizens inside a democracy because the citizens have, in effect, an unequal vote. Not an unequal vote in the ballot election, but in the money election. Not in the general election, but in the greenback primary. An unequal vote, which means they are unequal citizens. Their status is not respected in the same way, and so therefore the politicians don't respond to them in the same way. And number three, this fight in America against tweedism, I think is part of a much bigger movement globally, what we could think of as a global anti-corruption movement. Because what we're seeing across the world, as we recognize these grassroots citizen movements that are rising up to challenge the failures of democracy, is that though there are different corruptions around the world, the cause of the corruptions is different. What unites them is the recognition of the inequality that corruption produces. That is corruption. All corruption is this common failure in democracies, even if the causes of this failure are very different in these different democracies. Now, it's not clear whether these forces rising up against these corruptions can actually win. Most nations, when they enter this stage of corruption, are not capable of being saved. And many in the United States just fear that our problems are so severe, politics can't be changed. But what is clear is that we begin to see 70 years after the birth of the democracy movement that this is how democracies grow old. And so the constant fight of every generation is to make their democracy stay young. So, for example, I don't know if you followed what's been going on in Iceland. Extraordinary country after the collapse of 2008 there was an explosion of protest in the country against what was now revealed to be their corrupt government. And so what they did is they began a process to write a constitution, a grassroots, network-driven process. The first step of it was to gather 950 people out of a population of 300,000 in a random and representative way, randomly selecting 950 people to meet and then to talk about the principles, the values of what their constitution should embody. And then those values were published, and there was an election where 525 people, again, out of a population of 300,000, ran to serve on a drafting committee that would draft that constitution. 25 were elected. And in the period of 4 months, they wrote a constitution through an open process, a Facebook process. Every day, their proceedings were broadcast. Every night, comments were taken from Facebook. The next day, those comments were incorporated or responded to. And that produced a draft, which was then sent out to the people of Iceland to be ratified. And 2/3 of the people voting in that election ratified that new constitution. That's a picture of what we could think of as iDemocracy in the future. Random, representative, reflective, people-driven, politicians excluded. And it's an idea to end the reality of iCorruption that is our democracies today. But when you think about it, in Iceland, the ultimate question was whether Parliament would ratify the constitution the people had drafted and then themselves overwhelmingly supported. And the answer to that question, a measure of the continued corruption that is democracy around the world, is that to this day, 3 years after that process was finished, Parliament has still not ratified the people's constitution in Iceland. Okay, let me just give a couple final thoughts here. I'm going to go back to Dionne Warwick's question. What does the world need now? And the answer is the world still needs democracy now. Democracy still. It still needs a system of rule by the people, but actual rule by the people, finally, after generations of promising rule by the people and delivering rule by an elite, which is always rule by a corrupted elite. So rule by the people doesn't have to be stupid. That's what Iceland demonstrated. It can be informed, it can be intelligent, it can be independent. But what we need is this kind of iDemocracy rather than the iCorruption that we have right now. The hardest fact to accept is that it might be politicians can't give it to us. That around the world, the idea that we can turn to our politicians, our governments, and ask them to give us this uncorrupt democracy is just not possible. But if they can't give it to us, we can take it. And if we can take it, this is what we have to do, finally, to deliver on the promise that 70 years ago seemed to be the one hope that would make peace in the world possible. Thank you very much. Thank you.